The stagecoach lurched violently, throwing Clara against the worn leather seat as another wheel found a deep rut in the dusty trail. Through the small window, she watched the landscape of the American frontier roll past, endless stretches of sagebrush and dried grass, punctuated by distant mesas that rose like ancient sentinels against the bleached sky. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air inside the coach into a suffocating oven. Clara pressed a handkerchief to her damp forehead, her other hand instinctively smoothing the fabric of her best dress, a simple blue calico that had seemed so fine back in Missouri but now felt heavy and impractical in this harsh land. The dress pulled tight across her full figure, a constant reminder of what awaited her at journey's end. "Almost there, miss," the driver called down, his voice barely audible over the creaking wheels and jingling harnesses. "Dust Creek's just over that rise." Dust Creek. Even the name sounded desolate. Clara closed her eyes, and unbidden, the voices from back home flooded her mind. Poor Tom Harrington, her aunt had whispered at the church social, not quite softly enough. Having to take a mail-order bride, though I suppose Clara should be grateful. A girl built like her can't afford to be choosy. "She's got a pretty enough face," her cousin had added with false kindness. "If only she'd push away from the table once in a while." The memories stung as sharply as the alkali dust that seeped through every crack in the coach. Clara had endured 23 years of such comments, watching her slender cousins dance at socials while she served punch, seeing the way men's eyes slid past her to settle on more delicate forms. When Tom Harrington's advertisement for a bride had appeared in the St. Louis newspaper, she'd seen it as escape. A chance to build a life where her worth might be measured by more than the circumference of her waist. The coach crested the hill, and Dust Creek spread before her like a collection of matchboxes scattered across the desert floor. False-fronted buildings lined a single main street, their unpainted wood already weathered to the color of old bones. A few horses stood hitched at rails, their heads low in the heat. Beyond the town, the land stretched endlessly toward purple mountains that seemed to float above the shimmering horizon. Clara's stomach tightened, somewhere in that cluster of buildings. Tom Harrington waited. They had exchanged only a handful of letters, his writing terse and practical, focused mainly on her domestic skills and her health. He'd sent no photograph, only a description. "Tallish, dark hair, missing the tip of my left ear from a cattle drive accident." She'd sent him her likeness, taken 2 years ago when she'd been slightly slimmer, and had spent weeks dreading his response. When it finally came, he'd written only, "You'll do fine. Can you be here by August?" The stagecoach pulled to a stop in front of the Dust Creek Hotel, a 2-story structure that leaned slightly to the left. Clara gathered her courage along with her carpet bag and allowed the driver to help her down. Her legs, numb from the long journey, nearly buckled. "Miss Clara Winters?" She turned to find a man watching her from the boardwalk's shade. He was indeed tallish, with dark hair shot through with premature gray, and yes, the top of his left ear was missing, giving him a lopsided appearance. His face was weathered like the buildings around them, deeply lined, though she guessed him to be not yet 40. His eyes, a flat brown, assessed her with the same calculating look she'd seen him give cattle prices in his letters. "Mr. Harrington," she said, attempting a smile. He didn't return it. "Tom will do. Preacher's waiting at the church. Best get this done before the heat gets worse." Clara blinked at the abruptness. She'd imagined, foolishly, she now realized, at least a meal together first, perhaps a tour of the town, some small courtship ritual to ease the strangeness. But Tom was already reaching for her trunk, hefting it with the same practical efficiency he might use to load feed sacks. The church sat at the far end of the street, a simple frame building distinguished from its neighbors only by a wooden cross nailed above the door. A small cluster of people had gathered on its steps, and Clara's heart sank as she recognized the familiar expressions, curiosity mixed with barely concealed amusement. "That's her?" she heard a woman mutter. "Lord have mercy, she's a healthy one. Tom must need a lot of cooking done," came the snickered reply. Clara kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, a skill perfected through years of practice, but her cheeks burned, and sweat that had nothing to do with the heat trickled down her spine. The ceremony passed in a blur. Reverend Davies, a thin man with kind eyes, read the vows while Clara stood beside Tom in the stifling church. A handful of townspeople served as witnesses, the proprietress of the boarding house, the blacksmith and his wife, a few cowboys who seemed to have wandered in out of curiosity. Clara was acutely aware of how her dress clung to her damp skin, how her face must be flushed and shining. When Tom slipped a simple brass ring onto her finger, his touch was impersonal as a handshake. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend prompted. Tom leaned in and brushed his lips against her cheek, so quickly she barely felt it. Then it was done. She was Mrs. Tom Harrington, bound to this taciturn stranger in this desolate place. The wedding supper, such as it was, took place in the hotel dining room. Tom had arranged for a simple meal, beef stew, cornbread, canned peaches for dessert. The other diners kept stealing glances at their table, and Clara could practically hear their thoughts. She forced herself to eat sparingly, though hunger gnawed at her after the long journey. "Ain't you hungry, Mrs. Harrington?" asked Bessie, the boarding house proprietress, with false concern. "A girl your size must have quite an appetite." "The heat," Clara murmured. "It affects me." Tom said little throughout the meal, responding to questions with monosyllables. When asked about his ranch, he offered only, "It's 5 miles north. Small operation, mostly cattle, some horses." As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of copper and violet, the meal concluded. Tom stood abruptly. "Best get home before full dark. Trail's rough in places." Clara rose, aware of every eye in the room following her movement. At the door, someone called out, "Don't break the wagon springs, Tom!" followed by muffled laughter. She climbed into Tom's wagon, her new husband silent beside her as they rolled out of town. The wedding ring, already too tight in the heat, cut into her swollen finger. Behind them, she could still hear the laughter drifting from the hotel, carried on the desert wind like the cry of coyotes. The vastness of the land swallowed them as they traveled north, the lights of Dust Creek fading until there was only starlight and the creak of wagon wheels. Clara pulled her shawl tighter despite the warm air, already understanding that she had traded one kind of loneliness for another. Beside her, Tom drove in silence, as remote as the mountains that loomed invisible in the darkness ahead. The morning sun crept through the thin curtains of the ranch house, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stifling air. Clara had been Mrs. Tom Harrington for 3 weeks now, and each day had settled into a predictable rhythm of work and silence. She rose before dawn to prepare Tom's breakfast: salt pork, biscuits, black coffee, watching him eat without comment before he disappeared into the vast expanse of rangeland that surrounded their small homestead. The ranch house itself was modest: 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. The floors were packed earth covered with worn boards that creaked with every step. Clara had done her best to make it homely, hanging the few pieces of calico she'd brought from Missouri as curtains, arranging wildflowers in a cracked mason jar. But the harsh landscape seemed to leach the color from everything, leaving only shades of brown and gray. This morning, like every Wednesday, she needed to make the journey to town for supplies. Tom had left before sunrise to help neighboring ranchers with branding, taking their only saddle horse. That meant the hour-long walk each way under the scorching sun, carrying back whatever provisions she could manage. Clara tied her bonnet firmly and picked up the empty flour sack she used for shopping. The path to Dust Creek wound through stands of mesquite and greasewood, past ancient cottonwoods that clustered near the dry creek bed. Already, the heat was building, waves of it rising from the packed earth to distort the distant mountains. By the time she reached Morrison's general store, her dress was soaked with perspiration, clinging to every curve of her body. She paused in the shade of the boardwalk to catch her breath, pretending not to notice the group of women gathered near the millinery shop. "Lord above, look at her!" she heard Dolores Hutchins murmur. "Poor Tom. No wonder he takes those long cattle drives." "I heard he sleeps in the barn most nights," added Constance Morrison, the shopkeeper's wife. "Can you blame him?" Clara forced herself to enter the store. The bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed to mock her discomfort. "Mr." Morrison looked up from his ledger, his professional smile faltering slightly. "Morning, Mrs. Harrington. What can I do for you today?" She consulted her carefully written list. 10 pounds of flour, 5 of cornmeal, a pound of coffee, some salt pork if you have it, and— She hesitated, thinking of the coins in her purse. A small tin of lard. As Morrison gathered her goods, other customers entered the store. Clara recognized Jake Summers, a cowhand from the Double Bar Ranch, and his companion, a younger man she didn't know. They tipped their hats politely enough, but she caught their exchange of glances, the slight smirk that passed between them. "That'll be $3.40, Morrison announced. Clara counted out the money carefully. Tom gave her a precise allowance each week, not a penny more. As she loaded the supplies into her sack, she heard Jake's companion whisper something that included the words heifer and feeding time. The resulting snickers burned her ears. The walk home seemed endless. The flour sack grew heavier with each step, cutting into her shoulder. Sweat stung her eyes, and her feet, swollen in her too tight boots, screamed with each step. But it was the echoes of laughter, the whispered comments, that weighed heaviest of all. The landscape stretched endlessly before her, rolling hills covered in bunch grass and sage, dotted with the occasional juniper. In the distance, a dust devil whirled across the plain like a miniature tornado. Overhead, turkey vultures circled lazily, black specks against the merciless blue sky. This land felt as unforgiving as the people who inhabited it. When she finally reached the ranch, Clara found an unexpected sight, a rider watering his horse at their well. As she approached, the man turned, and she recognized Luke Harrington, Tom's cousin. She'd met him briefly at the wedding, remembering only a quiet presence at the back of the church. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Let me help you with that." Before she could protest, he'd taken the heavy sack from her shoulder. Unlike the men in town, his eyes held no mockery, only a quiet concern. "You walked from town in this heat?" he asked, setting the supplies on the porch. "Tom needed the horse," she said simply. Luke frowned but said nothing. He was taller than Tom, leaner, with sun-bleached hair and eyes the color of winter sage, where Tom's face was hard and closed. Luke's held a weathered kindness. "I'm heading out to check the fence lines on the north pasture," he said. "Tom asked me to look in on things while he's at the Baxter spread." Clara nodded, unsure why he was telling her this. In 3 weeks. Tom had barely mentioned his cousin, though she knew Luke worked various ranches in the area, hiring out his skills as needed. "There's wolves been coming down from the mountains," Luke continued, "getting bold with the drought-driving game scarce. You hear them at night?" She had long, mournful howls that seemed to echo the loneliness in her own chest. "Yes. Keep the rifle handy." "Tom showed you how to use it?" Clara flushed. Tom had shown her where he kept the Winchester, but hadn't bothered with instruction. I know where it is." Something shifted in Luke's expression. "I'll stop by tomorrow, if that's all right. Show you how to load and aim. Woman alone out here should know how to protect herself." After he left, Clara stood on the porch watching his figure disappear into the shimmering distance. It was the first real kindness anyone had shown her since her arrival, and it left her feeling oddly unsettled. That night, Tom returned late, smelling of cattle and sweat. He ate the supper she'd kept warm without comment, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "Luke stopped by today," she ventured. Tom's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Did he?" "He said there've been wolves. Luke says a lot of things." Tom pushed back from the table. "I'll be checking the stock." Clara watched him go, wondering if the women in town were right about where he spent his nights. The house felt even emptier after he left, filled only with the ticking of the mantel clock she'd brought from Missouri, a wedding gift from her mother. Now gone. Outside, the wolves began their nightly chorus. Clara cleaned the dishes and prepared for bed, her body aching from the day's exertions. As she brushed out her hair, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand. Her face was reddened from sun exposure, her dress stained with sweat and dust. She looked nothing like the hopeful bride who'd arrived 3 weeks ago. In the darkness of the bedroom, she could hear Tom moving around outside, the barn door creaking open. Another night alone. Clara pulled the thin blanket up to her chin despite the heat and listened to the wolves howl, wondering if they, too, were calling for something that would never answer. True to his word, Luke arrived the next morning just as the sun painted the eastern mountains crimson. Clara had been hanging laundry on the line stretched between 2 posts, the wet sheets already beginning to stiffen in the dry air. She heard the steady clip-clop of hooves before she saw him, giving her time to smooth her apron and tuck a stray strand of hair beneath her bonnet. "Morning, Mrs. Harrington," Luke said, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. "Tom leave already?" "Before dawn," Clara confirmed. "He's helping with the Baker Ranch drive. Won't be back for 3 days. If Luke found anything improper about visiting while Tom was away, his expression didn't show it. He simply nodded and tied his horse to the porch rail. "Best get started then. Fetch that Winchester." For the next hour, Luke patiently instructed her in the proper handling of the rifle. His teaching manner was calm and thorough, treating her with the same respect he might show any ranch hand learning a new skill. When Clara's first shots went wild, missing the tin can target by yards, he didn't laugh or grow impatient. "You're anticipating the recoil," he explained, adjusting her stance. "Plant your feet wider. That's it. Now breathe out slow as you squeeze. Don't jerk. The trigger." The next shot clipped the can, sending it spinning. Clara couldn't help the small sound of triumph that escaped her. "There you go," Luke said, and she caught the hint of a smile beneath his weathered features. "Few more sessions and you'll be out shooting half the men in the county." They moved to sit in the shade of the porch, Clara fetching cool water from the well. The silence between them felt different from the heavy quiet that surrounded Tom. This was companionable, easy. "Known Tom long?" she asked, then felt foolish. They were cousins, after all. "All my life," Luke replied. His PA and mine were brothers, came out here together after the war. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Tom's had a hard time of it. Lost his first wife and baby to fever 5 years back. Changed him." Clara hadn't known Tom had been married before. He'd never mentioned it, and no one in town had thought to tell her. It explained some of the distance, perhaps, though not the cruelty of his indifference. "I'm sorry for his loss," she said quietly. Luke studied her with those sage green eyes. "You're nothing like her," he said finally. "Sarah was fragile, like a little bird. Tom protected her something fierce, barely let her lift a finger." His gaze swept over Clara's sturdy frame, but not with the mockery she was accustomed to. "You're stronger. That's good. This land breaks the fragile ones." Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Tom would leave for days at a time. Cattle drives, fence repairs on distant pastures, helping neighboring ranches. And Luke would appear, always with some legitimate purpose. Broken gate hinges that needed fixing, a coyote den too close to the chicken coop that wanted clearing out. Each visit, he taught her something new: how to doctor a horse's minor wounds, predict weather by reading the sky, find water-bearing plants in the desert. "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the clouds purple and gold. She'd prepared supper for the ranch hands, including Luke, and they sat on the porch as the day cooled. Luke was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be alone out here," he said finally. "Maybe because you deserve better than whispers and turned backs." Clara felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away fiercely. She'd learned not to cry in this hard place, Tears were just another kind of weakness to be mocked. As the weeks passed, she found herself looking forward to Luke's visits with an eagerness that troubled her conscience. She was a married woman, after all, even if her husband seemed to barely tolerate her presence. But there was nothing improper in their interactions. Luke maintained a respectful distance, never touching her except to adjust her grip on a tool or steady her elbow when teaching her to shoot. Still, she began to notice things. The way his hair caught the light like winter wheat, the patient way he gentled a spooked horse, his rare smiles that transformed his serious face. Most of all, she noticed how he looked at her, not with disgust or pity or mocking humor, but as if she were simply Clara, a person worth knowing. The turning point came on a night when the first hints of autumn touched the air. Clara had been gathering the last of the kitchen garden vegetables when she heard horses approaching fast. Her blood chilled. Tom wasn't due back for 2 days, and riders coming hard usually meant trouble. But it was Luke who thundered into the yard, his face grim. "Rustlers hit the Baxter place," he said without preamble. "Killed 2 men, run off with 50 head, sheriff's forming a posse. But they're heading south. I think the gang's holed up in Devil's Canyon to the north." "Why aren't you with the posse?" Clara asked. "Because I think they're wrong. And because—" He stopped, jaw working. "Because Tom's crew is driving cattle through that canyon tomorrow. They'll ride straight into an ambush." Clara's heart clenched. Whatever his failures as a husband, Tom didn't deserve to die at the hands of cattle thieves. "We have to warn them." "I'm going now. Just wanted someone to know where I was heading in case—" He didn't finish the sentence. "I'm coming with you," Clara said. "No." The word came out sharp. "It's too dangerous." "You just spent weeks teaching me to shoot and ride," Clara pointed out. "And 2 sets of eyes are better than 1 in that canyon. You know it's true." They stared at each other in the gathering dusk, and Clara saw the moment Luke's resistance crumbled. "Can you ride astride? We'll need to move fast." 20 minutes later, they were racing north under a blanket of stars. Clara clinging to the saddle of Tom's spare horse. She'd hiked up her skirts and ridden astride for the first time in her life. Modesty be damned. The night wind whipped past, carrying the scent of sage and the distant howl of coyotes. They reached Devil's Canyon just as the eastern sky began to lighten. Luke raised a hand for silence, and they dismounted, creeping forward on foot. Below, in a natural bowl formed by the canyon walls, Clara could see the stolen cattle milling about. 4 men sat around a dying campfire, passing a bottle between them. "Tom's crew will come through that narrow pass," Luke whispered, pointing. "Perfect spot for an ambush." They retreated carefully, and Luke outlined his plan. It was risky, perhaps foolish, but they had little choice. As the sun climbed higher, they put it into action. Clara fired her rifle into the air from the south rim of the canyon, the shots echoing off the walls like thunder. As Luke had predicted, the rustlers scrambled for their horses, assuming the posse had found them. In their haste to escape north, they abandoned the stolen cattle and, more importantly, their ambush position. An hour later, when Tom's crew appeared at the canyon mouth, they found Clara and Luke waiting with the recovered cattle. Tom's expression as he took in his wife, dressed in torn skirts, dusty and exhausted but triumphant, was unreadable. Luke figured out where they were hiding. Clara said simply, "We couldn't let you ride into an ambush." The other men whooped and congratulated them, but Tom remained silent. That night, back at the ranch, the divide between them seemed wider than ever. But something had changed in Clara. She'd faced danger and hadn't broken. She'd made a choice and acted on it. As she lay alone in bed once again, listening to Tom's footsteps heading toward the barn, she thought of Luke's words, "This land breaks the fragile ones." Perhaps she wasn't fragile after all. Perhaps she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. The dust storm announced itself with a wall of brown that swallowed the horizon. Clara had been drawing water from the well when she spotted it, a rolling mountain of earth and wind bearing down from the northwest. turning the afternoon sky the color of dried blood. "Sweet mercy," she breathed, dropping the bucket. She'd heard tales of these storms but had never witnessed one. The chickens sensed danger, squawking and fluttering toward their coop. The horses in the corral wheeled and whinnied, eyes rolling white with fear. Clara ran for the house, slamming shutters closed and stuffing rags under the doors. Through the last window, she saw Luke riding hard toward the ranch, his horse's mane whipping like a war banner. He burst through the door just as the storm struck. The world exploded into chaos. Wind howled like a living thing, rattling the walls and sending dirt streaming through every tiny gap. The daylight vanished, replaced by an eerie brown twilight that pulsed with static electricity. "The livestock!" Clara shouted over the roar. "Already penned the cattle in the box canyon," Luke shouted back. "But the horses—" They both knew the horses couldn't be left in the open corral. Without discussion, they tied bandanas over their faces and plunged back into the maelstrom. The wind nearly knocked Clara off her feet, and she couldn't see more than an arm's length ahead. Luke grabbed her hand, the first time he'd ever touched her deliberately, and together they fought their way to the corral. The horses were panicking, rearing and crashing against the rails. Working by feel and instinct, Clara and Luke managed to lead them one by one into the barn. The last horse, Tom's prized stallion, broke free and bolted into the storm. Luke started after it, but Clara caught his arm. "You'll die out there!" she screamed against the wind. For a moment they stood frozen, her hands gripping his arms, their faces inches apart. Then Luke nodded, and they stumbled back to the house. Inside, they collapsed against the door, gasping. Dirt covered everything, their clothes, their skin, their hair. Clara's eyes streamed tears that left muddy tracks down her cheeks. The storm raged on, and they could do nothing but wait. "You all right?" Luke asked, his voice hoarse. Clara nodded, then realized he couldn't see her in the darkness. "Yes, you? Been through worse." But she heard the shake in his voice. They were sitting close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the mixture of sweat and sage and leather that seemed to cling to him always. They waited out the storm sitting side by side on the floor, backs against the door. Sometimes the wind would lessen enough for them to talk, about inconsequential things mostly. Luke told her about breaking horses in Texas, about the time he'd been caught in a blizzard and survived by cutting open a dead steer and crawling inside. Clara shared memories of Missouri summers, of helping her mother can preserves, of the church socials where she'd always served punch but never danced. "Why didn't you dance?" Luke asked during a lull. Clara was grateful for the darkness that hid her face. "You know why." "No," he said quietly. "I don't." The sincerity in his voice undid something in her. "Because girls like me don't dance. We serve. We watch. We make ourselves useful and try not to take up too much space. That's horseshit." The profanity startled her. Luke rarely cursed. "Pardon my language, but it is, you saved Tom's crew. You worked this ranch harder than most men. You're worth 10 of those town gossips." Clara felt tears threaten again, and this time they had nothing to do with the dust. No one had ever defended her like that. No one had ever suggested she had worth beyond her domestic skills. The storm began to die as suddenly as it had arrived. The howling softened to a moan, then to whispers, then to silence. Clara and Luke sat in the aftermath, neither moving to light a lamp or open the door. "Clara," Luke said, and her name on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. "You deserve—" The door burst open, sending them sprawling. Tom stood silhouetted against the brown sky, his face a mask of dust and fury. "Well," he said, voice deadly quiet, "ain't this cozy?" Clara scrambled to her feet. "Tom, the storm! We were saving the horses!" "I can see what you were doing." His eyes moved between them, cold and calculating. "My wife and my cousin, alone in the dark." "Nothing happened," Luke said, rising slowly. "You know me better than that." "Tom." "Do I?" Tom stepped inside, tracking mud across the floor Clara had swept that morning. "Know you've been sniffing around here every time I turn my back. Know you've been filling her head with notions." "Tom, please," Clara began, but he rounded on her. "Shut your mouth. Woman? Bad enough I'm saddled with a wife who looks like a prize sow. Now I find her rolling in the dirt with my own blood." The words hit Clara like physical blows. She'd heard worse in town, but somehow, from Tom, her husband, the man who'd promised before God to cherish her, they cut deeper. Luke took a step forward, fists clenched. "You take that back, or what?" Tom laughed, ugly and bitter. "You'll defend her honor? Look at her. Luke, really look. You think I don't know why I can't stand to bed her? Why I sleep in the barn rather than climb on top of that?" Luke's fist connected with Tom's jaw before he could finish. Tom staggered back, then charged forward with a roar. The two men crashed into the table, sending Clara's carefully arranged wildflowers flying. They rolled across the floor, trading punches, grunting and cursing. "Stop!" Clara cried. "Please, stop!" But they were beyond hearing, lost in years of buried resentment and fresh rage. Tom was heavier, but Luke was faster. They crashed into walls, overturned chairs, shattered her mother's clock against the mantel. Finally, Luke managed to pin Tom against the floor, arm pressed against his throat. "Apologize to her," he growled. Tom's eyes found Clara, full of such hatred it made her step back. "I'll see you both in hell first." Luke held him a moment longer, then released him with a sound of disgust. Tom rolled to his feet, spitting blood. He looked between them once more, then stalked out into the storm-darkened evening. Clara surveyed the wreckage of her home, broken furniture, scattered belongings, the shattered clock that would never tick again. Luke stood in the middle of it all, knuckles bleeding, chest heaving. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't!" Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Don't apologize for being the only person who's ever stood up for me." They looked at each other across the ruins, and Clara felt something fundamental shift. Whatever happened now, there was no going back. Tom's words had shattered more than just her mother's clock. They'd broken the last illusions she'd held about her marriage, about her place in this harsh land. Outside, she heard Tom's horse galloping away, running to town. No doubt, to drink and complain about his wronged honor. Tomorrow the whole county would know about the scene in the Harrington house. The whispers would follow her everywhere, worse than before. But standing there in the wreckage, looking at Luke's battered face and gentle eyes, Clara found she didn't care. For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she felt something other than shame and loneliness. She felt alive. "You should go," she said quietly, "before he comes back." Luke nodded slowly. At the door, he turned back. "Lock this behind me. Load that Winchester and keep it close. Tom's mean when he's sober, but when he's drinking—" After he left, Clara did as instructed. She barred the door, loaded the rifle, and sat in the ruins of her home to wait. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the smell of dust and distant rain. Change was coming to Dust Creek, whether anyone was ready or not. Tom didn't return that night, or the next. By the third day, Clara had restored some order to the house, though the broken clock remained on the mantel, a reminder of violence that could erupt without warning. She went about her chores with the Winchester always within reach, jumping at every sound that might herald her husband's return. The news came at sunset on the fourth day. Sheriff Daniels rode up with 2 deputies, their faces grim beneath their wide-brimmed hats. "Mrs. Harrington," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "I'm afraid I've got bad news. The Colson gang hit the Rocking J Ranch last night, killed 2 drovers and the foreman, made off with near 100 head. Clara's blood chilled. The Rocking J was only 15 miles north. "The Colsons? I thought they were down in Mexico." "Apparently not anymore." Daniels shifted in his saddle. "We're warning all the isolated ranches." "You here alone?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Your husband still in town?" There was something knowing in the sheriff's eyes. The whole county had probably heard about the fight by now. "He's away on business," Clara managed. Daniels exchanged glances with his deputies. "Well, you'd best not stay here alone. The Coulsons are mean as rattlesnakes and twice as unpredictable. They've been known to—" He cleared his throat. "They don't just rustle cattle, if you take my meaning." After they left, Clara stood on the porch watching darkness creep across the desert. The sheriff was right. She shouldn't stay alone. But where could she go? Back to town to face the mockery and whispers. She'd rather take her chances with the outlaws, as if summoned by her thoughts. A rider appeared on the horizon. Clara raised the rifle, then lowered it as she recognized Luke's familiar silhouette. He dismounted at a distance, hands visible. "It's just me," he called. "Heard about the Coulsons. You shouldn't be here," Clara said, though relief flooded through her. "And you shouldn't be alone." He approached slowly, and in the dying light she could see the fading bruises from his fight with Tom. "I've been staying at the line shack on Miller's Creek, close enough to hear trouble, far enough to keep tongues from wagging worse than they already are." They stood awkwardly on the porch, the memory of their last meeting hanging between them like smoke. "Have you heard from Tom?" Luke asked finally. "No?" Clara hugged herself against the evening chill. "The sheriff said I should leave, but this is your home." Luke's voice held understanding. "You've worked too hard to abandon it now. It's not just that." Clara struggled to find words for the feeling. "If I run now, I'll never stop running. From the Coulsons, from Tom, from everything." Luke nodded slowly. "Then we'd best prepare." They spent the next hours fortifying the house. Luke helped her shutter the windows more securely, stack furniture to create defensive positions, fill every available container with water in case of siege. As they worked side by side, the awkwardness faded, replaced by the familiar comfort of shared purpose. "I'll sleep in the barn," Luke said as full darkness fell. "Keep watch." "You'll do no such thing," Clara said firmly. "If the Coulsons come, we'll need to be together to defend ourselves. You can sleep by the fire. I'll take the bedroom." It was scandalous. A woman alone with a man not her husband. But scandal seemed a small concern with killers roaming the territory. They settled into an uneasy vigil. Clara lay fully dressed on the bed, the Winchester beside her, listening to every creak and sigh of the house. Through the thin walls, she could hear Luke moving about, stoking the fire, checking the windows. His presence should have made her nervous, but instead she felt safer than she had in months. Near midnight, the wolves began howling, closer than usual, agitated. Clara sat up, heart pounding. The howling stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence. "Clara," Luke's whisper came from outside her door. Something spooked them. She joined him at the front window. Peering through a crack in the shutters, moonlight bathed the yard in silver, creating deep shadows around the outbuildings. At first, she saw nothing. Then, movement by the well. A figure. Then another, creeping toward the house. 3 of them, Luke breathed. Maybe more. Clara's mouth went dry. They were outnumbered, trapped, but as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered all the time she'd been mocked, dismissed, overlooked. Anger kindled in her chest, clean and bright and strengthening. "They think they'll find easy pickings," she whispered, "a woman alone. They're about to learn different," Luke said, and she heard pride in his voice. The attack came swiftly. The front door exploded inward under a heavy boot, and men poured through, dirty, wild-eyed, stinking of whiskey and violence. Luke met the first with a shotgun blast that sent him flying backward. Clara fired the Winchester from behind the overturned table, the recoil familiar now from weeks of practice. The house erupted in gunfire and shouts. Smoke filled the air, acrid and choking. An outlaw rushed Clara's position, and she swung the rifle like a club, catching him across the jaw. He went down hard, and she felt a savage satisfaction. "The window!" Luke shouted. Clara spun to see a man climbing through the bedroom window. She fired without thinking. the bullet catching him in the shoulder. He screamed and fell back into the night. The battle seemed to last forever and no time at all. When the smoke cleared, 2 outlaws lay groaning on the floor. Another had fled into the darkness. Luke stood panting, a graze bleeding on his cheek. Clara's hands shook as she lowered the Winchester. "You all right?" they asked simultaneously, then shared a breathless laugh. They tied up the wounded outlaws to await the sheriff. As Clara tended Luke's wound by lamplight, her hands gentle on his face, something shifted between them. The violence had burned away pretense, leaving only truth. "Clara," Luke said softly, catching her hand. "When I thought they might hurt you, I know," she whispered. "I know." They sat close together as dawn approached, keeping watch over their prisoners. When Luke's arm came around her shoulders, Clara didn't pull away. It felt natural. Right, like coming home after a long journey. "What happens now?" she asked as the eastern sky began to lighten. "I don't know," Luke admitted. "Tom will come back eventually. The law, the town, they'll all have something to say about this." Clara thought about the women in town, their whispered cruelties, about Tom's cold eyes and cruel words, about all the ways the world had tried to make her small. Then she looked at her hands, steady now, capable, hands that had defended her home, that had refused to break. "Let them talk," she said firmly. "I'm done being afraid." As the sun rose over the desert, painting the mountains gold and crimson, Luke's hand found hers. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he said quietly, "and the most beautiful." Clara turned to look at him, this man who saw her truly. In his eyes, she found no mockery, no disgust, no pity, only admiration and something deeper, warmer. "You're the only beauty I see," he whispered, the words landing like a benediction, washing away months of hurt and shame. For the first time since arriving in Dust Creek, Clara believed she might actually belong in this hard land, not as the scorned wife, the target of ridicule, but as herself, capable, strong, worthy of love. The future remained uncertain, full of challenges and difficult choices. But sitting there in the morning light, Luke's hand warm in hers, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The sheriff arrived at midday with a posse of 6 men, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. The 2 wounded outlaws sat trussed like turkeys against the barn wall, cursing and moaning by turns. Sheriff Daniels whistled low as he examined the bullet holes peppering the house. "Hell of a fight," he said, then tipped his hat to Clara. "Pardon my language, ma'am, but from what these boys tell me, you gave as good as you got." "Better," Luke said quietly from where he stood near the corral. "She's the one who winged Jake Colson through the window, sent him running with his tail between his legs." The posse exchanged impressed glances. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her chin high. She was done shrinking from attention. "Where's Tom?" Daniels asked, his keen eyes taking in the domestic damage inside, the broken furniture from days ago, the shattered clock. "Still away on business," Clara said evenly. The sheriff nodded slowly, clearly not believing a word but choosing not to press. "Well, we'll take these 2 off your hands. There's a reward for the Colson gang, $50 a head, dead or alive. I'll see you get your share. Mrs. Harrington." After the posse left, Clara and Luke worked in companionable silence to clean up the worst of the damage. Glass from the broken window glittered like diamonds in the afternoon sun. Spent shell casings rolled across the floor with metallic whispers. The house smelled of gunpowder and fierce sweat. But beneath it all, Clara caught the scent of new beginnings. As evening approached, Luke reluctantly prepared to leave. They both knew he couldn't stay another night. Surviving an outlaw attack together was one thing, but the appearance of impropriety was another. "I'll be close," he promised, checking his rifle. "At the line shack. If you need anything." "I know," Clara said softly. They stood on the porch, the sunset painting the desert in shades of copper and rose. "Luke, The sound of approaching horses cut off her words. They both tensed, hands moving to weapons, then relaxed as a familiar wagon rolled into view. But it wasn't Tom driving. It was Bessie Palmer from the boarding house, accompanied by the minister's wife, Mrs. Davies. Clara's stomach sank. Here it came, the confrontation, the condemnation. She straightened her spine, ready to face whatever harsh words they'd brought. But Bessie's first words surprised her. "Lord have mercy. Child, we heard about the attack. Are you hurt?" I'm fine," Clara stammered as the two women climbed down from the wagon. "Mrs." Davies bustled forward. Her normally stern face creased with concern. "When Sheriff Daniels told us what happened, a woman alone, fighting off those monsters, well, we couldn't just sit in town clutching our pearls. They'd brought supplies, fresh bread, preserves, medical supplies, even a pie still warm from the oven." Clara stood frozen as they fussed over her, checking for injuries, exclaiming over the bullet holes, praising her courage. "Always said you were made of stern stuff," Bessie declared, though Clara was quite certain she'd never said any such thing. Not like some of these fainting flowers who'd have swooned at the first sign of trouble. Luke excused himself quietly, tipping his hat to the ladies. Clara watched him go with mixed feelings, gratitude for his discretion, longing for his presence. "Now then, Mrs." Davies said once Luke was gone, her voice gentling, "where exactly is that husband of yours while you're fighting for your life?" Clara's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. To her horror, tears began rolling down her cheeks. "I don't know," she whispered. "He left after we quarreled. That was 5 days ago." The two women exchanged knowing looks. Bessie put a plump arm around Clara's shoulders. "Come inside, dear. Let's have some tea and that pie." They spent the next hour in the kitchen, and Clara found herself pouring out the whole story. Tom's coldness, the cruel words, the fight with Luke. She expected judgment, but found only sympathy. "Tom Harrington's a fool," Mrs. Davies said bluntly. "Always was, even before poor Sarah died. But after—" She shook her head. "Grief can twist a man, make him cruel. That's no excuse." Bessie interjected. "Plenty of folks face loss without taking it out on others, and the way some people in town have treated you." She had the grace to look ashamed. "Well, it wasn't Christian." As night fell, they prepared to leave. At the door, Mrs. Davies pressed a small revolver into Clara's hands. "This was my husband's from the war. Easier to handle than that rifle for close work. You keep it handy." "Why are you being so kind?" Clara asked, overwhelmed. Bessie smiled sadly. "Because we've all been fools, judging by appearances instead of character. It took you standing up to the Colson gang to open our eyes. You've got more grit than half the men in this county." After they left, Clara sat alone in her kitchen, the pie half-eaten on the table. The house felt different now, not just because of the bullet holes and broken window, but because something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer the scorned outsider. She'd earned something more valuable than acceptance, respect. Near midnight, she heard horses again. This time, her blood recognized the rhythm before her mind did. Tom was back. Clara loaded the little revolver and tucked it into her apron pocket, then positioned herself by the table, hands folded calmly. She wouldn't cower, not anymore. Tom burst through the door like a thunderstorm, reeking of whiskey and rage. His clothes were filthy, his face gaunt with drink and sleeplessness. He stopped short when he saw her sitting calmly in the lamplight. "So," he slurred, "the whore's still here." "This is my home," Clara said evenly. "I defended it. Where were you when the Colsons came?" His face darkened. "Don't you dare question me, woman. My own wife, carrying on with my cousin for the whole county to see." "Stop." Clara stood, and something in her bearing made Tom step back. "I've done nothing to shame you or myself. Luke helped me fight off outlaws who would have burned this place to the ground. That's all." "That's all?" Tom laughed bitterly. "I've seen how he looks at you, how you look at him. You think I'm blind. I think you're a coward," Clara said quietly. The words hung in the air like gunshots. You hate me because I'm not Sarah, because I'm strong where she was delicate, because I survived where she didn't, and you hate yourself for needing me anyway. Tom's face went white, then red. He lunged forward, hand raised, but Clara was ready. The revolver appeared in her hand, steady and sure. No more, she said. You won't hit me. You won't touch me. You want to drink yourself to death mourning a ghost. That's your choice. But you won't drag me down with you. They stood frozen, predator and prey reversed, in Tom's bloodshot eyes. Clara saw surprise, rage, and something else, perhaps a glimmer of the man he'd been before grief poisoned him. Get out, he said finally, voice raw. Pack your things and get out. I'll not have you under my roof another night. Clara had expected this, had been preparing for it since the moment she'd pointed the gun at her husband. I'll go, but this is my home too. I've worked it, bled for it. I'll take what's mine, the chickens, the kitchen goods I brought, and Buttercup. The gentle mare had been her only request since arriving. Tom's jaw worked, but he nodded curtly. Take them and go. But if I see you or Luke on my land again... He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. Clara packed by lamplight, taking only what she could carry. As dawn broke, she loaded her meager possessions into the small cart, tied Buttercup behind, and took one last look at the ranch that had been her prison and her proving ground. Tom stood on the porch, a hollow-eyed specter against the morning light. For a moment, Clara almost pitied him. Then she remembered his words, his cruelty, his indifference, and her pity evaporated like dew in the desert sun. She drove away without looking back, heading toward an uncertain future but away from a certain misery. The mountains ahead glowed pink and gold with promise. Somewhere out there, Luke waited, somewhere out there, a new life beckoned. The rifle that had defended her home lay across her lap, the revolver heavy in her pocket. Clara Thompson Harrington, no, just Clara Thompson once more, was ready for whatever came next. She'd faced outlaws and overcome them. She'd faced her husband and found him wanting. Most importantly, she'd faced herself and discovered strength she'd never known she possessed. The sun climbed higher, warming her face as she drove toward tomorrow. Behind her, the ranch grew small and distant, like a bad dream fading with the dawn. Ahead, the vast frontier stretched endless and full of possibility. Clara drove the cart toward town as the morning sun climbed higher, but she couldn't bring herself to enter Dust Creek just yet. Instead, she turned toward Miller's Creek, where Luke kept watch from the line shack. She needed to tell him what had happened, needed to see his face before deciding her next move. She found him mending fence near the creek, his shirt off in the growing heat. He straightened as her cart approached, and she saw the quick progression of emotions across his face. Joy at seeing her, concern at the loaded cart, understanding as the pieces fell into place. He threw you out, Luke said. It wasn't a question. I left, Clara corrected, climbing down from the cart. There's a difference. Luke's smile was proud and sad all at once. Yes, there is. They stood apart, the creek babbling between them like a chaperone. So much had changed. Yet Tom's shadow still fell across them both. What will you do? Luke asked. I don't know, Clara admitted. I have the reward money from the Colsons. Maybe I'll find work in town, or... Clara. Luke stepped closer, his green eyes intense. I've been thinking all night, and I need to say this. Tom's my blood, but what he's done to you is wrong. The way he's treated you, the things he's said... His jaw clenched. You deserve better. You deserve someone who sees you for who you really are. Clara's heart thundered, but she kept her voice steady. Luke, we can't... I know. He held up a hand. I'm not asking for anything. Not yet. You need time to find your feet, to figure out what you want. But I want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. The declaration hung between them like morning mist. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but they were different from all the tears she'd shed before. These held hope. "I should go," she said softly. "Town will be talking enough without—" The sound of galloping horses cut her off. They both turned to see Tom approaching fast, accompanied by 3 riders. Clara's blood chilled as she recognized Jake Colson's brother, Will, and 2 other hard cases she didn't know. Well, Tom called as they reined up. "Didn't take long to find you warm in my cousin's bed, did it?" "Tom." Luke stepped forward, hand moving to his gun. "What are you doing with these men?" "Business partners," Tom said with an ugly smile. "See, Will here's upset about his brother getting shot. Thinks someone owes him compensation. And since my dear wife did the shooting—" "That was self-defense," Clara protested. The sheriff ain't here," Will Colson interrupted. He was smaller than his brother, but meaner looking, with dead eyes and pockmarked cheeks. "Way I see it, you owe me blood for blood. Or," Tom added casually, "they're willing to accept the ranch as payment, sign it over to them, and everyone walks away clean." Clara understood then. Tom had found a way to punish her and Luke both while getting rid of a ranch that held too many painful memories. He'd sell his soul to outlaws rather than see her happy. "You can't do this," Luke said, his voice low and dangerous. "That's her home too. She worked that land. She's an adulteress," Tom spat. "No court in the territory would side with her." The accusation hit like a physical blow, even though it was false. Clara saw how it would play out. Tom's word against hers, his new partners backing his claims, her reputation, already fragile, would shatter completely. "I'll sign," she heard herself say. "Clara, no," Luke started. "I'll sign," she repeated firmly. "But only if you put in writing that all debts are settled. No coming after me or Luke later." Tom's smile was triumphant. Done. They completed the grim business there by the creek, Tom producing papers he'd clearly prepared in advance. Clara signed away her claim to the ranch she'd defended with her life, her hand steady despite the rage burning in her chest. When it was finished, Tom and his new associates rode off without another word. Clara stood watching the dust settle, feeling oddly lighter. The ranch had been a prison as much as a home. Now she was truly free. "I'll kill him," Luke said quietly. "Cousin or no, No." Clara touched his arm. "He's not worth hanging for. Besides, he's made his bargain. Men like the Colsons don't make good partners. He'll regret this soon enough." Luke's expression softened as he looked at her. "How are you so strong?" "Because I have to be." Clara said simply, "Now, I really do need to get to town. Find lodging, look for work, marry me." The words stopped her cold. Luke flushed but didn't take them back. "I know it's too soon," he continued in a rush. "I know you need time. But Clara, I've loved you since the day I taught you to shoot. You're the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever known, and Luke," Clara's voice was gentle but firm, "I can't marry you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I've just escaped one marriage where I was less than. I need to know who I am on my own first." Luke nodded, hurt flickering in his eyes, but understanding too. "I'll wait, long as it takes." Clara drove to town with her heart full of conflicting emotions. The main street of Dust Creek looked different somehow, smaller, less threatening. At Morrison's store, she was greeted not with sneers but with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Harrington." "Mr. Morrison exclaimed. Miss Thompson," Clara supplied. "I'll be going by my maiden name now." Of course. Heard about your troubles. Tom's a fool, if you don't mind my saying." The boarding house was full, but Mrs. Davies offered her a room in the parsonage. Just temporary. Mind you, until you get settled. Can't have the woman who fought off the Colson gang sleeping in her cart. Over the next days, Clara discovered something remarkable. The same people who'd whispered and mocked now treated her with respect, even admiration. Her stand against the outlaws had transformed her in their eyes from object of ridicule to local heroine. She found work quickly. The restaurant owner practically begged her to help with cooking and serving. The pay was modest but fair. And Clara discovered she enjoyed the bustle and conversation after months of isolation. But it was at the weekly market where the real transformation occurred. Clara stood behind her booth selling eggs from the chickens she'd kept, her chin high as the familiar faces passed by. Some still whispered, but now the words were different. Brave. Crackshot. Showed those outlaws what for. Dolores Hutchins, who'd been among the cruelest gossips, actually approached to buy a dozen eggs. I owe you an apology, she said stiffly. I judged you harshly. That wasn't Christian of me. Clara accepted the apology with grace, though she didn't pretend things would change overnight. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild. As weeks turned to a month, Clara settled into her new life. She saved her money carefully, planning for a future she couldn't quite see yet. Luke kept his distance as promised, though she felt his presence like a guardian angel, fixing a loose board on the parsonage porch while she was at work, leaving fresh game on the doorstep, always nearby if trouble arose. Tom, meanwhile, had disappeared. Some said he'd ridden south with the Colsons. Others claimed he'd drunk himself to death in a mining camp saloon. Clara found she didn't much care. That chapter of her life had closed. One evening, as she walked home from the restaurant, Clara caught sight of herself in the mercantile window. The woman looking back wasn't the frightened bride who'd arrived on the stagecoach months ago. This woman stood straight, moved with confidence, met the world's gaze without flinching. She was still full-figured. That hadn't changed. But now she saw strength in those curves, capability in those solid arms, beauty in the face that had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. "Evening, Miss Thompson," called Jake Summers, the cowhand who'd once snickered at her in the store. He touched his hat respectfully, and Clara nodded back with quiet dignity. The sun was setting over Dust Creek, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Somewhere out there, Luke was waiting, patient as the mountains themselves. Somewhere behind her lay the wreckage of a marriage that had nearly broken her. But here, in this moment, Clara Thompson stood on her own 2 feet, beholden to no one, afraid of nothing. She'd found her strength in the crucible of the frontier, and no one, not Tom, not gossips, not outlaws, could take that from her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were still those who whispered, still those who judged. But Clara had faced down the Colson gang and lived to tell the tale. After that, what was a little gossip? She turned toward the parsonage, her temporary home, her steplight despite the long day's work. In her pocket, the little revolver rested comfortably, a reminder that she could protect herself, that she was no one's victim. The frontier had tested her and found her worthy. Now it was time to build the life she'd always deserved. On her own terms, in her own time. And if that life eventually included a certain green-eyed cowboy, well, that would be her choice to make, when she was ready. For now, it was enough to be Clara Thompson, survivor, defender, woman of the West. Beautiful not despite her strength, but because of it. Spring arrived in Dust Creek with a profusion of wildflowers that carpeted the desert in purple and gold. Clara stood on a small rise overlooking the valley, breathing in the sweet scent of desert marigolds and brittle bush. 6 months had passed since she'd left Tom's ranch, 6 months of building a life entirely her own. The small homestead spread before her, 160 acres claimed under the Homestead Act, modest but hers. With her savings from the restaurant and the Colson reward money, she'd managed to file a claim on an abandoned parcel 5 miles east of town. The previous owners had given up after a drought year, but Clara saw potential where they'd seen only hardship. "Coming along nicely," Luke said from behind her. She no longer startled at his appearances. He'd been helping her build for the past month, ever since she'd filed the claim. "The chicken coop's almost finished," Clara said, gesturing to the sturdy structure. "And the garden's taking well. Those seeds Mrs. Davies gave me are already sprouting." Luke moved to stand beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. They worked together most days now, building, planting, planning. But he never presumed. He'd kept his promise to wait, though Clara sometimes caught him watching her with eyes full of patient longing. "Heard news in town," he said carefully. "About Tom." Clara's hand stilled on the fence post she'd been examining. "Oh, he's dead. Shot trying to rustle cattle down near the border. Seems his partnership with the Colsons didn't work out as planned." Clara waited for some feeling, grief, relief, something. But there was only a distant sadness for the man Tom might have been, the life they might have had if bitterness hadn't poisoned his heart. "I'm sorry," she said finally, and meant it. "He was your family. He stopped being family the day he treated you cruel," Luke said quietly. "Man makes his choices. Tom made his." They worked in companionable silence for a while, Luke helping her string wire for the garden fence. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth and coaxing more blooms from the desert floor. A roadrunner darted past, chasing a lizard through the sage. "The Johnsons are selling their draft horses," Luke mentioned casually. "Good team, reasonable price. You'll need them for plowing come full summer." "I've been thinking about that," Clara admitted. "The restaurant pays well, but running both places is wearing me thin. I might need to make a choice soon." "Or," Luke said slowly, "you could take on a partner, someone who knows horses, can help with the heavy work." Clara straightened, meeting his eyes directly. "Luke Harrington, are you proposing a business arrangement?" "If that's what you want to call it," he said, a smile tugging at his weathered features. "Though I'm hoping for more, eventually, when you're ready." Clara set down her tools and really looked at him. This man who'd stood by her through the worst, who'd defended her honor, who'd waited patiently while she found her strength. The afternoon light caught the gold in his hair, highlighted the laugh lines around his green eyes. "I'm not the same woman who stepped off that stagecoach," she said softly. "No," Luke agreed. "You're stronger, more beautiful, more yourself. I may never be slim like other women. I'll always be—" "Perfect," Luke interrupted firmly. "You'll always be perfect. Not despite anything, but because of everything. Your strength, your courage, your kindness, even to those who showed you none. Clara, I've watched you become who you were always meant to be." "And I love every inch of you." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks, but for once they were purely happy. "I don't need rescuing anymore." "I know," Luke said. "That's not what I'm offering. I'm offering partnership, equal stakes, equal work, equal say. Build this place together, make a life together. What do you say?" Clara looked out over her land, their land. If she said yes, she thought of the long journey that had brought her here, the pain and triumph, the discovery of her own strength. She'd proven she could stand alone. Now, perhaps, she could choose to stand with someone who saw her true worth. "I say," she said slowly, "that we'd better get to town and see about those draft horses. Partners should make decisions together." Luke's whoop of joy startled a covey of quail from the brush. He caught her hands, then hesitated. "May I kiss you? Properly. This time?" "You'd better." Clara laughed through her tears. The kiss was everything their wedding kiss hadn't been. Tender, passionate, full of promise. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "When?" he asked simply. "Soon," Clara promised. "Let me file the partnership papers first. Do this proper, legal. I want everyone to know I'm choosing this free and clear." They were married a month later, on a perfect May morning with the desert in full bloom. The ceremony took place on their land, with half the town in attendance. Mrs. Davies served as matron of honor. Bessie Palmer baked the cake, and even Dolores Hutchins brought a wedding quilt she'd sewn herself. Clara wore a new dress, blue like the desert sky, cut to flatter rather than hide her figure. When she walked toward Luke, she didn't see pity or mockery in the crowd's faces. She saw respect, admiration, and genuine joy for their happiness. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," Luke whispered as she reached him, loud enough for the front row to hear. "You're the only beauty I see." Clara whispered back, the words that had once healed her heart, now a promise between them. Reverend Davies performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. When he reached, "Speak now, or forever hold your peace," Clara felt no fear. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared. "You may kiss your bride." This kiss was neither hurried nor perfunctory. Luke cupped Clara's face gently, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of patience rewarded, love acknowledged, future promised. The crowd erupted in cheers. The celebration lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of food, Clara's own cooking supplemented by dishes from every woman in town. Musicians played, and couples danced on the packed earth near the house. Clara danced every dance, Luke's strong arms guiding her, no longer the girl who served punch from the sidelines. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the newlyweds stood together watching their guests. Their land stretched out around them, not vast like Tom's ranch, but theirs, built with their own hands and hearts. "No regrets?" Luke asked softly. Clara thought of the frightened girl on the stagecoach, of the lonely wife in the empty house, of the woman who'd stood against outlaws and won. Each version had led her here, to this moment, to this man who saw her truly. "None," she said firmly. "This is where I was meant to be." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Clara leaned into her husband's embrace. Tomorrow would bring work, always work on a homestead. There would be challenges, droughts, storms, the 1,000 difficulties of frontier life. But they would face them together, as equals, as partners, as two people who had found in each other not just love, but recognition. The girl who'd been mocked for her body had become a woman celebrated for her spirit. The bride who'd been scorned had become a wife truly cherished. And in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the American West, Clara and Luke Harrington had carved out their own small paradise, proving that love could indeed be the only beauty that mattered. As the last guests departed and they turned toward their home, their true home, Clara felt the weight of the past lift completely. She was no longer Clara Thompson, the girl too large for love. She was Clara Harrington, rancher, wife, survivor, and warrior. She was herself, fully and completely, and she was loved for exactly who she was. The coyotes called in the distance, but their cries no longer sounded lonely. They sounded like freedom, like wilderness, like home. And as Luke's hand found hers in the starlight, Clara knew that her real story, their story, was just beginning. Thank you all for listening to this tale from the Wild West. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this story from, whether you're driving through the desert, sitting by your own campfire, or just taking a break from your day. Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of love, courage, and adventure from the American frontier. And share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, partners.